Welcome to Thinking Christian about faith, culture, and life. I'm Grady King with Oklahoma Christian Church Resources, as well as co-leader of Hope Network Ministries. We are joined today by Peter Cariaga, and Peter is the director, the group coordinator for Third Culture Kids at Oklahoma Christian. And he has a very interesting topic today. Can't wait to get into this, Peter. Call and response, hearing God in the cries for racial justice. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Grady. It's great to be here.
And that title is a long title, Call and Response, Hearing God. I mean, it's an interesting, intriguing title, The Cries for Social Justice. I assume you're speaking out of personal experience as well as kind of pushing us in some ways that God's wanting us to move. So just take it away, and I'll try not to interrupt you too much. So
yes,
ahead.
It is a bit of a long title because I was trying to think of not just what all I could cram into it, but what could actually express what I'm trying to do. And I'll take it one step at a time there in terms of that call and response part first.
Okay.
See, what we find in the Bible is God calling people. God calls Moses to be the leader of his people. God, even before that, calls Abraham, of course, to go from one part of the world to another. Jesus calls his disciples to follow him, and Paul uses this language in Ephesians of calling to say that he wants his readers to be worthy of the call to which you've been called.
Right.
And so God calls us in all kinds of ways. And when we think about the language of call, it's also kind of interesting to think about the ways in which we usually think about it. The popular language might be, "Oh, you found your calling," when you display talent, or you find that you're good at something, or for that matter, you find something later in life that you're good at, and people say, "Oh, you missed your calling with that." But what I would suggest is that what we think of as calling is not just limited to one little thing that you can do, and it's not limited to just those things in which you have naturally occurring talent. God calls people to live into a way of being, sometimes even despite the talents that they have. I mean, think of Moses and his saying, "You want me to be a speaker? I'm not a very good speaker." And God says, "We can work with that. Answer the call." And what you see in the Bible is people, for the most part, who answer the call. They respond to God's call. Now, some may take a little bit longer than others, i.e. Jonah, for example, or Paul, for that matter. But the ways in which these people show up as faithful is they answer God's call. Now, we usually think of call, or vocation is another term for it, in terms of our own personal calling and vocation. What are the things that God is calling me to do? What are the things that I can do to serve the church? How might I live out my vocation?
Right.
I want to suggest, though, that churches can think about vocation and about call, not just in terms of each member's individual call, but the church's call, the call of the local congregation, God calling the local congregation to be and to do and to act in ways that are not only glorifying of God, but also further God's purposes in the world.
Wow. So I was thinking, I'm glad you mentioned the word vocation. I was thinking that's the Latin word vocatio, that we get vocation or work from, and this idea of communal calling. What is God calling the church to, a local congregation to embody, because they are God's people, to reflect who God is, imitators of God.
Yes.
So when it comes to this cry, this response, if we say, "Yes, God, we're going to answer," and we're going to say yes to you. So now we're at this point of listening to the cries of people.
Yes. And that is where the call sense of this is actually has a layered meaning to it, because God is calling, certainly, and sometimes you have calling that seems very clear to you. You've known, let's say, on an individual level, you've known that you wanted to be a doctor or a preacher since you were 5 years old. You get into something that you have a marked talent for, and you know that that's what you're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
You have these clear senses of call, but it doesn't work just through those ways, through you trying out something and finding that you're good at it, or you having a really clear sense within yourself that God is calling you to do something. God also works through people. I mean, you see God working through the pen of the Apostle Paul to call the Ephesian church and others who received that letter to a calling to which they've been called. And I would suggest that God is still working, perhaps even primarily working through the people around us, to bring our attention to call, to affirm that call, as well as to get us to answer that call. Think about this: the young man who preaches his first sermon at 12 years old, and little old lady from the first pew comes up to him afterward, puts her hand on his shoulder and says, "My boy, you're going to be a preacher." That could be a form of call, either calling his attention to it or affirming it.
That actually happened. That actually happened to me when I was like 14 or 15 years old.
Really?
On a Wednesday night lesson. And it was a little old lady that I really loved in that church. And when she said that, I thought, hey, it's no way I want to be a preacher. No way. And so people that know me through the years go, and you really never have been. But anyway.
Oh, come on.
That's all right. So
go ahead. It doesn't have to be a thunderclap from above. It can be a little old lady putting her hand on your shoulder. It can be a friend coming up to you and saying, hey, you really should think about this. It could be the moment that the congregation finds itself in to turn toward a communal sense of call, looking around them and saying, this is a situation that all of us are in, that our neighbors are in, that our community's in. What are we going to do to respond to it? How are we going to answer the call to do something in this moment? And so, in terms of the latter part of my title, as far as answering cries for social justice, here's what I'm suggesting. If calling, vocation, is not just individual, but is communal, and if vocation is something that is not just a thunderclap from above, and not just something that happens when I get a clear sense of it in my own self, but is something that other people around me are either telling me about or calling me calling us to, then what we are seeing right now, what we have seen and continue to see here in this year of 2020, in terms of cries for social justice, are, I suggest, a form of calling, of God using others around us to call us to respond in such a way that is not only honoring to God, but takes the things that make up our being, make up our gifts, make up who we are as a people together, make a response for the community.
Right.
So as far as churches answering a call together, if we think of calling as not just individual but communal, that God is calling an entire congregation together, and if we think of calling not just in terms of, like I said, a thunderclap from above, or a conviction within but rather voices from around us as well, then what we can see as far as the things that we've seen in the summer of 2020 with protests, with tears, with fists raised, but also with people coming into our offices tired, with people coming into our pews with their heads down because they just are exhausted. When you have all of these things going around with not just our neighbors, but our own members and our own brothers and sisters, what we see here, I suggest, is God calling us to respond in some way that honors God, certainly, but that also honors those of us, those people who are around us.
Boy, that pardon me, but that just is really good, because I think of two things in juxtaposition, opposites. Mm-hmm. We can either choose to listen to the call that isolates us, mm-hmm. or that we move toward engagement. And mm-hmm. so what I hear you advocating is, if we're listening to these cries around us, whatever expression that is, it should move us toward engagement, not isolation, just mm-hmm. barely hold on and, circle the wagon, so to speak, because mm-hmm. we just got to get through this. Well, let's use it as mission and ministry and engagement with God's power behind mm-hmm. us and in us.
Yes, yes. Now, part of what needs to be considered there is what we bring to our call, what we bring to our response, rather. And I want to suggest that we are called because of the positions that we're in and because of the gifts that we've been given. And gifts really do relate to call in this way. When I say gifts, I don't just mean the innate talents that we have. I don't just mean singing ability or how tall one is or not, or how far your eyes can see, or those kinds of things. I'm talking about gifts that God gives. And somebody who's been really helpful in my thinking about this is a writer named Kathleen Cahalan. And she says that there are, we can think of gifts in three different ways. That we have gifts of knowledge, of skill, and of virtue. So if you have gifts of knowledge, for example, you know Scripture really well. Not just where to find things, but you have a sense of where one passage is in the whole. Or for that matter, the resources to connect people in your neighborhood if they need it. Maybe you have a background in social work or in something else, and the kinds of things to connect your neighbors with who need them, or perhaps other church members. These gifts can be from training. They can also be from practical knowledge that you have. There are also gifts of skills, and these are certainly those in which one might have talent, but also those that have been built up by practice and by competence that you have. So one can have skills to preach. One can also have skills in pastoral care, in relating to another person who is in grief, who's hurting, who not only needs somebody to talk to, but to guide them along the way.
Sure. And
you also have gifts in terms of virtue. And here's where it's a little bit fuzzier to pin down in terms of empirical data. But you can sense, most people can at least, a humble person when you're in their midst. You can sense a charismatic person when they're in their midst, somebody who's gregarious, who's warm, who attracts people to them and leads them into things. You can also sense persons who are sincere, and leaders who are non-anxious, and folks who are coming alongside you as imperfect and flawed as they acknowledge that they are, but are still wanting to not just help, but to be a part of your life and all the things that you're trying to live through. Mm-hmm. We bring all of those to our call and to our response, both as individuals as well as churches. So it would be not just interesting, but I think quite fruitful for for church leaders as well as members to sit down and start thinking about what are our gifts, certainly as individuals, but what are our church's gifts? What do we know as a collective body? What are we skilled at as a congregation? What are our virtues as a gathered people? And what can we bring to the call that God has in front of us as a response to meet the needs of those around us?
Well, I like that. My mind works on putting those in categories on a sheet of paper or on a whiteboard and taking a group of leaders that's a cross section of the church maybe, and saying, hey, let's look through this and reflect on this to kind of discern what God's calling us to. That's good stuff. I love that. So you're specific though about in this time that we've been experiencing over the last few months, that how does that come to bear upon the social justice, which is a really amorphous kind of, different generations hear that phrase differently. So
yeah, and that is a good question, and especially if you are not personally touched by it or know others who are, it can be even more amorphous. Let me tell you what. Let me tell you a series of interconnected stories with the setup that I grew up in the Philippines. My dad is Filipino, my mom is American. And although I did spend some time here in the States, I was mostly in the Philippines. And from the time that I was very, very young, I knew that I was different from those around me. In part because people would look at me in ways that I later realized had the sense that there's lots of things familiar about this kid, but there's also some things that are different. My height, for example, is much higher than most Filipinos. And although I have black hair, brown eyes, and browner skin, I also have freckles, which is not something that you see there very often. And of course, when I open my mouth, I speak American English. I always knew I was different. And I actually got a lot of advantages for that when I was there. And still do whenever I go to visit. That was always my sense. I came here to Oklahoma Christian to study, and what I knew was that I was following in the narrative of those who had come before me. My grandfather, of course, is Filipino, had come. Then my father, who is Filipino, came. I, who am half Filipino but grew up in the Philippines, come. And it seemed to be always just this straight line. Of course I was going to come to Oklahoma Christian. Of course I was going to do these things. When I came back to work here, I learned from a colleague in an almost nonchalant way that part of the reason that my story intersects with OC, with Oklahoma Christian, in a way that I had taken for granted was because during the 1960s, when my grandfather was here, he had applied to go to another school and had been rejected, almost certainly on account of his skin color. Wow. My grandfather his skin color is darker even for a Filipino. And while I'm still trying to verify this, my understanding is that there were some other international students who did get accepted with comparable grades and things like that, but their skin color was not the same shade as my grandfather's.
That's pretty that's deep.
And so it became, and so these cries that I heard even several years back around me suddenly became very personal to me because it was because that same blood flows through my veins. And even if I have the advantages of being half white, whether it's in the Philippines or here for that matter, it is still a part of my story. And it actually made me realize just how fragile what I had taken for granted actually was. The reason I'm here And that other institution is because of the choices of some folks sitting behind a desk looking at pictures of students and deciding whether they would come in or not, in some cases based on their skin color. And so part of what also makes it personal to me now is this. My son is 3/4 Filipino because my wife is Filipina herself. And my son and I share a lot of similar features, but when he smiles, his eyes are more almond-shaped than mine. His skin tone is darker than mine. You see him and you definitely think little Asian boy. And what I wonder is if when he is an older child, if people will ask him, "Where are you from?" No, really, where are you from? And if they will make fun of the color of his skin, or if on the playground kids will come up to him and pull at the sides of their face in the way that they say is imitating his eyes. When he gets to be older and is in high school or even college, will people say you speak really good English based on the fact of how he looks when he opens his lunch? If it's something that he's brought from home and it's a rice-based meal, will they think that is weird or stinky? Will they come up to him at a later time and ask, "Do you speak any other language? Would you say something for us?" Basically, in order to entertain us. When he's older, even still as an adult, will he be writing on the sidewalks about something that he believes in, and somebody come up to him and ask, "Is this your property?" even when it is? Will he have to worry about somebody coming up to him and harassing him and say, "Go back to where it is that you're from"? Will he, if there is something like the coronavirus going on in the future that is blamed on Asian populations, will he have to worry about coughing while Asian, as some of the Filipino Americans in the United States in the summer of 2020 have had to put up with? I ask myself those questions about my son, and I have to say, I got to do something. Because it's not just about my past that's connected with these calls for social justice. It's about my son's future as well. And so you say that this is personal for me. Yeah, it really is.
Well, I can feel the emotion in your voice. I know you've shared this stuff before, and we've even talked about it informally to some degree. But still, no matter how much, it's so woven into who you are that unless we listen carefully, I think that's part of this hearing the cries is taking, I'm thinking humility, listening skills, or just listening and being humble and trying to not have sympathy at all, but empathize. Genuine empathy is really called for as a God response, as a Christian response.
Mm-hmm. It is. And I think that is possible even if you don't have the same stakes in this that I do, because we are all not just interconnected, but we are, and not just in this together. We are all persons who have been called by God through his son Jesus. All of us who are in the church, we've been called by God to live in ways that reflect who God is and who God's son is. There's a quote that's attributed to Martin Luther King Jr. that says this: "In a real sense, all of life is interrelated. All humans are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And here's where it's important for calling. King says this: "I can never be what I ought to be. I can never, in other words, live into my full calling, my full vocation, until you are who you ought to be. And you can never be who you or what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This, says King, is the interrelated structure of reality. Wow. And to me, that calls to mind the language of Paul in talking about the body, that it's not just that one part can go off and say, I will be an eye all by myself, or I will be a foot all by myself, or I can do things independently of the rest of you. All of us in the body of Christ are interconnected. Where it comes into play with the cries of racial justice is this, that if a part of the body is hurting, let's say the African American congregations in our midst, in our fellowship, and if we in other settings are not hurting, that means there is a disconnect somewhere. And when that kind of disconnect happens in a human body, that means there is illness present. And that means that there needs to be some sort of healing that has to happen. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that all forms of healing when it comes to racial injustice and racial inequalities, and even separations between Black congregations and white or majority non-Black congregations, that all of those things need to be healed immediately. But one of the things that can at least help us go in the right direction for a healthy body is to hurt alongside those who are hurting themselves.
Wow. This gets heavy it gets personal, it gets heavy, and I keep thinking of this passage in 2 Corinthians that we love to quote from an individualistic standpoint. If anyone is in Christ, he's a new creature, in 2 Corinthians 5:17. What we forget is 2 Corinthians 5:16 is I used to look at things from a worldly point of view. I even looked at Christ that way. Mm-hmm. So there's this shift from this radical individualistic, what's in it for me, my perspective, guarding my stuff, to this communal sensitivity and empathy and hurting with others. Mm-hmm. So, we got about 4 or 5 minutes left. So let's move toward, what are some practical things? I mean, obviously, the church needs practical things to do, and they don't have to be incredibly complicated. They can be very simple. Mm-hmm. What are some takeaways and some practical things you would want us to gain from this conversation?
The first thing is actually talking about it in a communal setting. Maybe it doesn't have to be the entire church, and probably for most churches out there, it's not feasible to be the entire church, but whether it's in small groups or just in pockets of groups of members who can come together, just start talking about, okay, what are we seeing around us? What are we hearing around us? What seems to be a call that we need to respond to around us with regard to social justice? There are going to be some congregations who look around and say, yeah, it's right here in our neighborhood, the kinds of things that we're being called to do. And they may have very specific things that they're being called to do by their neighbors, and have to discern what that looks like for them. There's also going to be congregations that look around and say, well, we've not had much in our neighborhood, and the challenge for those congregations is going to be who are the people in our communities whom we can either reach out to, or that we can ask, what are the things that we can do, and their action might not be necessarily to go out and do a lot of things, but it might be simply to connect their own members and perhaps people around the community with resources that engage what it looks like to be a Christ-like, loving community seeking to be involved in racial justice and reconciliation. So that's one thing.
Sure.
Having the conversation, starting the conversation. The other thing is keeping that conversation going, and you can do that in one of two ways. You can keep internal conversations going.
Right.
You can also start some external conversations. And so in the church plant that my family is a part of, one of the things that we have done is to have some internal conversations about, okay, what are some of the things that are at stake for us in our community, and what are some of the things that we can do? Our next step is to reach out to some of the African American brothers and sisters in another congregation in our fellowship, and to ask them, all right, we're in a moment where we are made painfully aware of how much listening we need to do. We want to listen for a while so that we can come alongside each other and move toward ways in which we can better be the body of Christ together. And that will need to start in many ways. Actually, it can start from either top down or from the bottom up.
Yep,
it can look like leaders of a congregation calling up the leaders of another congregation and saying, hey, we know we need to do something. Can you come alongside us, not to do the work for us or to teach us all the things that we don't know, but can you come alongside us and help us see a way that we can move forward together?
Mm-hmm.
That can be what it looks like from the top down. It can also bubble up from those smaller organized groups, whether it be small groups or just pockets of interested members, reaching out to their friends, their neighbors, other members in especially majority Black congregations, and asking them, hey, we don't want you to just teach us, we don't want you to do the work for us, but we want to ask you, what are some ways in which we can come alongside each other?
Do you find that the younger they are, the easier it is? In other words, I'm thinking teenagers often could be a place that could really move and motivate, because the younger they are, like my daughter and my son's generation, 37 and 33, are much less, they don't have some of the same stereotypes that my generation grew up in. And they're a lot more accepting and see things. And so the younger they are, they can lead in this and show us a way in many ways. Even children can do it. There's a lot. I'm just thinking all these practical things that you're stimulating, which means we'll have to have another conversation to talk about this some more. But this has been really good. Any last word?
I would say for anybody who is involved with conversations about racial justice, whether young, mid-age, old, realize that what this is about is not about assigning guilt, ultimately.
That's really,
and if
really good.
And if that is something that you find yourself being defensive about, or other kinds of things, just know that it's not ultimately about guilt. And even if there are some things that need to be worked through, it is ultimately about ultimately about not only unity in the body, but about all persons in the body of Christ, and, God willing, even those who are on the periphery of that.
Right. It's really,
all of these persons. A
true meaning of God's justice.
Yes, exactly. exactly.
That's where we're headed. We're called to imitate God, so we want to know what's there. Wow. Well, Peter, this has been really, really interesting and good and personal. I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing. And we hope to have you on another time. Thank you for doing this. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Grady.
This has been, you're quite welcome. This is Thinking Christian about faith, culture, and life. And we hope to see you soon in the near future.